Hey, good people. This week we are going to be exploring the topic of crime and deviance in our society. Our textbook addresses several different issues relating to the topic of crime and deviance. And it starts out by giving us definitions of crime and deviance. We explore a little bit several theorists and their understanding and or explanation of deviant or criminal behavior. But then also our textbook explores briefly the issues relating to controversies as well as consequences behind mass incarceration. So as you're reading through the textbook and as you're reviewing some of this information, I encourage you to really think about what you're thinking about. And as you go into the discussion post, really dig deep into some of the conversation and explore other references, I should say, that you can cite in your discussion post as it relates to the particular issues regarding deviance and criminal activity. So as I stated, the book kind of opens us up to the definitions of deviance and crime. We know that crime is a violation of our societal and cultural norms. Deviance is a violation of our cultural functions, like what we say makes sense to us, what the foundation may be. Now, when we begin to talk about deviance and crime, it's good for us to have, again, a foundation, a theoretical perspective in which we begin to explore some of the ideas and some of the consequences and some of the controversy about crime and criminal behavior. So one of the theorists that our book brings out or discusses is Cesar Lombroso. Lombroso was a theorist that stated that criminal behavior could be determined by a person's physical characteristics or their physical makeup. We got to think about that, good people. What does that lead us to? And that can kind of get us in trouble when we talk about determining someone's character based on their physical characteristics. Kind of leads us into this whole concept of the labeling theory. The labeling theory is something that Howard Becker talked about. And that labeling theory, when we get into looking at that, we have to think about it in two specific areas when we talk about secondary deviance and primary deviance. With that primary deviance, we're looking at someone who is actually committing the deviant act or the criminal activity. That secondary deviance is the label that we give to somebody just out of mere association. So when we're thinking about how we define someone based on physical characteristics, or a label, we got to be mindful, of what are we setting someone up for, or how are we making sense of their behavior in the realms of looking at it from a topic of crime and or deviance. So we have Cesar Lombroso, Howard Becker. Those are two theorists. Another theorist that, we go way back to Intro to Sociology would be Emile Durkheim. Emile Durkheim talked about deviance from the perspective of, that sometimes deviant behavior is necessary for society to function. I need you to think about that, y'all. How does deviance feed into the functioning of society, whether it is purposeful or whether it is not purposeful? How does it help us function in society? How does it help us make sense of what our cultural norms are? Another theorist that, again, we go way back to Intro to Sociology, is Robert Merton. If you remember, Robert Merton had Merton's strain theory, and it is also reviewed in this textbook. Under Merton's strain theory, he talks about, deviance and makes a point of giving us reference to there's 5 elements when we think about deviance and defining deviance. And the elements that he identifies in his theory start out with conformity, innovation, ritualism, retreatism, and rebellion. So I need you to kind of review the chapter, good people, and get an understanding about what each of those elements represents. How do we see that played out in society? Conformity, who conforms to the norm. Innovation, get it by whatever means necessary. Again, looking at how am I achieving my cultural goals. When we talk about retreatism is how am I falling back from, how am I rejecting the culturally approved goals, but still identifying goals for myself that I think I need to meet, but meeting them in a way that is against the cultural norm. When we talk about ritualism, how am I sticking to the rules of achieving, again, the culturally approved goals? And rebellion, I'm just falling out to be falling out way back. I don't want to have anything to do with anybody meeting any kind of goals. I'm rebelling against society as a whole. That's Robert Merton and his theory. So we have Cesar Lombroso, Howard Becker, Emil Durkheim, Robert Merton. I need you to think about these theorists as you're reading through them, or reading about them, I should say, in the chapter, and consider some of the information that they share. And I'm going to jump a little bit back to Howard Becker when we were talking about the labeling theory. There's going to be a video that I post in this week's module that I want you to take a look at. And I really want you to consider the information that you see in this video, as well as the information that you read in the textbook. And it's all about the medicalization of society. And how is that creating this element of deviance? How are we medicalizing deviance? How are we trying to control? Again, that social control theory. How are we trying to control deviance through medication, or what one may define as deviant behavior? All right, so think about this, and I'll be posting a video. And again, you'll have an opportunity to discuss that on the discussion board. As we get into the topic of crime and criminal behavior, our book breaks down for us 3 specific categories of criminal activity. We have felonies, misdemeanors, and infractions. We know that infractions are things that usually are going to be dealt with paying fines. Misdemeanors, there may be minimum jail time. Felonies, we know there's going to be a lot of jail time. So read about these 3 different types of infractions. When we think about the punishment that comes with these infractions, we have to ask ourselves, since the beginning of time and the creation of our criminal justice system, and this is a good question for you all in the criminal justice program, what is the purpose of the punishment that folks receive? What is the purpose of the punishment? So our goal, or I should say our book addresses 4 different types of, or 5 different types of punishment, or consequences, I should say, or goals of punishment that we may see coming down through the criminal justice system. It talks about retribution, deterrence, incapacitation, rehabilitation, and recidivism. The recidivism rate, that continuing to be on this cycle of I'm incarcerated, I'm free, I'm incarcerated, I'm free. When we think about rehabilitation, the question comes to my mind: can someone who has been incarcerated become rehabilitated? And what does rehabilitation look like? What does that look like? When we think about rehabilitation and what that looks like, we kind of get into this issue when our book talks about the consequences of mass incarceration, this issue of reentry. And what does rehabilitation look like as it impacts the way society functions? Again, the consequences of incarceration. How does the consequences, how do we see that played out with social norms and social interaction? We think about it from a reentry rate. How are we setting folks up for success? Or in our society, do we set them up for failure? When we talk about that whole idea of reentry, when we think about reentry, what does that look like? Or I should say, when we talk about mass incarceration, what does that look like for the individual when they want to have that element of reentry? The book talks about from an individual perspective, that we have folks that, of course, that struggle with family life, folks that struggle with public life. We begin to lose some of our rights as individuals when we're thinking about, the consequences of mass incarceration. What are the consequences that family members deal with when we're looking at, again, mass incarceration? When we're looking at it from a family perspective, the individual, yes, they have their issues that they deal with, and not only sociological, but also psychological or mental issues. When we're talking about it from the family's perspective, we have to look at all elements relating to this person. From the family, and we look at children, we deal with poor academic performance. We deal with behavioral problems. We deal with, again, the stress that family members may experience when their loved one is incarcerated. Also, when we're talking about consequences of mass incarceration, we look at the community as a whole, that macro perspective, y'all. What is going on within our communities when we think about, the outcome or the consequences of mass incarceration? We have to look at the unemployment status and look at income or socioeconomic status. We look at the stigma that's associated with that whole idea of being incarcerated or formerly incarcerated. kind of tiptoeing back to that labeling theory. So consequences of mass incarceration, the individual, the family, the community, and society as a whole. Now, also when we talk about mass incarceration, we cannot ignore that there is some controversy relating to mass incarcerations. Some of the controversy that we see, or one of the issues that we see when we talk about mass incarceration, is an issue of race and race and punishment. How is our society functioning, or how do we make sense of um, race as it relates to crime, punishment, and deviance? Sorry, had a brain cramp for a minute. When we think about race and criminal activity or punishment, we know that there is a disparity. And our book gives us some great information on the disparity in numbers when we're considering the incarceration rate of Black people versus white people. When we look at the entire criminal justice system, and we think about the rate of all races, white, Black, Hispanic, and how does the book explain, the likelihood of incarceration based on race? So again, these are some of the things that we have to consider when we're talking about race. I'm sorry, not race, when we're talking about deviance and crime in our society. So this is a brief overview of what our book addresses with us. I encourage you to read that, the textbook, the chapter in its entirety. Watch the videos that I post for you guys in the module. And there will also probably be an additional article reading that I would ask that you all would read over as well. All this information will be covered, or elements of it addressed on the discussion board, and possibly also in your homework assignment for this chapter. All right, good people, that's crime and deviance, a brief overview for this week's chapter. You all know how to get in contact with me if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. Either contact me by email or by phone. With that being said, I bid you love, peace, and bacon grease, and I'll meet y'all on the discussion board.